Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this masterclass. I'm Alejandro Rubio. I'm the Master's Director of High Performance. And in this Master's, we are focused on the development of high performance athletes, its training, its conditioning, and the use of the newest technology in this field. Today, we have a treat for you. We have the training and conditioning specialist from Real Madrid, Jorge Rubio. He's the specialist of the Cadete team, which is under 15 in Real Madrid. So please enjoy. Hello, Jorge.
Hello. There we go.
All right, they are yours.
Okay, let's start. So, oop, there we go. Quickly, a bit about myself. I did my degree in England, and then I did my master's degree at the Universidad Europea Real Madrid, which was a great experience. I did another master's, but any master there is really, really good. And I'm currently doing my PhD still there in the Universidad Europea. And okay, so today's masterclass is about making decisions through GPS data. So obviously, before going to the final section where we will be discussing how to make these decisions, we need to first understand what monitoring load is. So what is load? Load is basically the cumulative stress, so what happens adding it over time and over a period of time. So not what happens in one match or one training session, like the sum of everything throughout time. And it is known that there's many types of load: physical loads, social loads, and psychological loads. But for the purpose of this masterclass, we will just focus on physical loads. So normally we divide these two in internal and external loads, but it's not about looking into one of them. It's actually looking into both of them and seeing how they interact between each other. So first of them, internal load, is basically the biological stress that's happening in your body. So how is your body reacting to that exercise? This can be measured in many ways. It can be through heart rate with heart rate monitors, blood lactate through taking a blood sample at some point, oxygen consumption, which is a bit hard on field, but in laboratories it's quite easy to do, or through a rating of perceived exertion, which is one that most teams use because it's very cheap and very easy to use. And here we can see how in every case they are measuring them. One of them is through an app at the top left, and you're seeing rate of perceived exertion. At the bottom left, you can see a blood lactate sample. In the middle and bottom right, we can see two different ways to measure heart rate, and top right, measuring oxygen consumption through exercise. This is an example of the scale of the rate of perceived exertion. It's quite important when you're measuring rate of perceived exertion that you always use the same scale, don't change over time. Now, going into the other part of the equation, external load, it's quite simple. It's what you've done. So how much have you run, how many accelerations you've done, your maximum speed, how many times you've changed direction. Nothing to do with your body, basically what your body did during exercise. And this can be presented in these kind of charts, where every column is a different player and every chart is looking at something different. The top one is looking into high speed in different ranges. The one in the middle, you're looking at accelerations and different intensities. And the bottom one is just distance, and it's relative to time. Each one of them is going to give you information about something different. For example, the middle one acceleration is going to be talking about mechanical load and how much load has passed through the muscles during exercise, whereas the other two might be looking more into a cardiovascular effect during exercise. And this is a table from one paper, which basically highlights many different ways to look into load internally and externally. And as you can see, GPS is there highlighted. It's probably nowadays one of the most common ones to measure external load, but be aware that there's many ways you can track load. So before talking about GPSs, we really need to be talking about EPTS devices. GPSs are inside this category. So an EPTS device is an electronic performance tracking system, which as a GPS does, you use it to monitor how to improve the players, and you track them through the position of the players in combination with other sensors that the GPS might have to detect impacts or something more specific. And something that's really useful nowadays is that they allow you to do a real-time analysis and give you immediate feedback. So again, EPTS devices, you can divide it into three different categories. Optical-based tracking systems, which is basically cameras looking into you and tracking your position. Global navigational satellite systems, which is where GPS lands, is basically the device connected to satellites. And then the local positioning systems, which is the same, but connected into local antennas to see for indoors mainly. And as I've said, GPS lands within global navigational satellite systems. Now, what does EPTS track? EPTS tracks many things. Like, this is nothing compared to what software gives you nowadays. These are some examples of a few parameters I look or I've looked at some point in my career. That doesn't mean I look into all of them all the time, because it's just too much information, and sometimes you don't have the time, or it just gives you contradicting information. In terms of distance, which is going to have more of a focus on cardiovascular, you can look into distance per minute to make sure it's relative to time, or high-speed running distance. Acceleration is going to be more focused on the mechanical load, but especially on the quadriceps area, on the anterior chain. Sprint is completely the opposite. It's going to be focused on the posterior chain. Heart rate is with an asterisk, because normally GPS devices don't allow you to track heart rate unless you have a sensor band in your chest, and that will then allow you to track what you're doing in relation to your heart rate. And then there's this last column, which is the load column, which sometimes is a bit misunderstood. These are all estimations of load, of how is the player being loaded through acceleration, speed. So these equations normally give you a quantity of load, but you normally don't know where it came from, because it can be added through speed or accelerations or on different planes. So you sometimes need to be careful with this information. So now, how can we use this data? If you look into an article, a paper article, scientific article, it'll give you this to monitor, to describe, to plan. What's the long term? What's the short term of what you can do with these GPS devices? But I feel it's more comprehensive if you look at it into this way: competitive profile, training, injury prevention, return to play, and research. For this masterclass, we won't go into too much detail in all of them, but we'll have a quick glance into all of them, but not the research one. First one, competitive profiling. basically what has the athlete done in every match they've played, and what do they normally do when they play a match, and what happens if they play in a different position, so on. Sorry that I have to censor some information, but you can have an idea that these three formats give you the same information, just in different ways. This is where you can be a bit creative and get your artistic part of yourself out and see how can you show this information to the coach or to the players, and they can find it attractive somehow. So we now link competitive profile to training, and this is where we start making these decisions with your data. Okay, so understand what's happening in the training sessions. Depending on the training session, you want to focus it more towards strength, more towards velocity, more towards heart rate. Obviously, always trying to meet the demands that will allow you to compete. Your main objective is that the athlete is ready for the competition. So during training, you want to hit those targets to make sure when the athlete competes, he's able to be fit enough for that training session, for that competition. So if you're going to focus more on strength, you'll probably be looking into accelerations, decelerations, and changes of direction. When you are looking into a heart rate response, a cardiovascular response, you might be looking into distance, high metabolic load distance, or similar ones. And if you're looking into a velocity session, you'll be looking at distances above 18 kilometers per hour, maximum speed, number of sprints, etc. So depending on the day, this is a quick chart of how you can structure the week. On the left, we have the day code, so how far away or close we are from a match. So match day +1 would mean you're 1 day away from the match. So you played yesterday. Match day +2, you played 2 days ago. And then from then onwards, you normally do match day -4, -3, -2, -1. But there's many ways of doing it. Some people do it game day +1, game day +2, game day +3, +4, and then and then -2, -1. It's really just finding your own way and understanding it and making sure you stick with it. In this case, the days after the match, we would either rest or give them a bit of load there. If they played a lot of minutes, so you need to give them some recovery. And in the other hand, if they didn't play enough, you need to give them a top-up to make sure that if this player is needed in the future, he's not lost fitness because he's not competing in the weekends. Then you normally have on match day -4 a lot of accelerations and decelerations. And then on match day -3, you look at the opposite. Instead of small spaces, larger spaces to make sure you're hitting that distance, high speed running distance, etc. And depending on the objective, you're now going to look into what happened in your training session to adapt it in the future. So in this case, we can see on the top left in the circle that it was a match day -4. And then we have the parameters in the left column, what happened in the training session in the middle, what happened in the match in the other where it says partido, and then the percentages at the right. So we are comparing what we did in the training session to what normally happens in a match to see how close it was from competition. So as I've said before, match day -4, we're focusing on accelerations and decelerations, and we can see that the session was really similar to the match. So we could assume that this training session was a good one because we're meeting the demands of the competition. But that might not always be true because, as we can see in this slide, the average shows you what happens in the whole match. But there's times where the competition is more intense than it normally is, and there's periods of time where it's under the average. So in my opinion, sometimes it's not about reaching the demands of the competition, the overall demands. It's more about meeting that peak demand, the most intense scenario, the worst case scenario, and make sure that when that moment in the match happens, your players are able to cope with it. So we also have some metrics, which are most intense intervals. And in this case, in match day -4, we can see that the 3 most intense intervals were met. So this was a good training session. Another way you can start making decisions through GPS data is with the players who played more and the players who played less. In the past, we can see that we divided the players into players who played more than 60 minutes and players that played less than 60 minutes. And they did like some top up, some complementary work. But that was generic, the same for all of the players. So maybe that could lead to errors in load, because maybe a player has been doing a lot of accelerations throughout the week. They don't play enough. And then in the top up session, you add a lot of accelerations. But that player had already been doing a lot of accelerations, so he really didn't need that many accelerations. Nowadays, with the GPS devices, we can look at what they've been doing through the week, and we can divide the group into different groups, subgroups, and depending on their needs. So some of them might need high-speed running distance, and some of them may need accelerations. And then you can divide the group and do it together, but with different objectives. So this is what this paper talks about. It talks about seeing what happens in the week, then analyzing what happens in a match, and adapting that that top-up session to what will be happening in the week and what happened in the match. So not as much as we were doing in the past of generic work for everyone. In this case, we are adapting and making sure every player meets their needs. So this could be an example. We can have here the players in purple. The players in purple are players that need more high-speed running distance, and the players in white need to add more accelerations, and the player in black is the goalkeeper. Okay, so if we look at the top left, we can see it's a small space, and one by one, the white players go and press for maximum intensity for 15, 20 seconds. And then when I play the whistle, that player leaves, and then a new one comes in. And that, because it's really short distances, they won't be adding high-speed running distance, but they will be adding a lot of accelerations and intense accelerations. But the purple players, because they are static in a really small place, they won't be adding accelerations nor high-speed running distance at this point. So with that drill, we are making sure that the white players are reaching their goals. If we go to the right-hand side, it's again a possession game, but every so often you can blow the whistle, shout a number, and one of the purple players, which need high-speed running distance, might have to run to a cone and back at 75% of their max speed to add some high-speed running distance. Again, you can check that live through an iPad and see and make sure that they're running at the appropriate speed. And in this case, you're meeting the demands of the purple players, and you're not adding high-speed running distance to the white players. And then a final drill for both of them could be the one at the bottom, which they're just doing passes. And if you when you blow the whistle, the purple player has to run a further distance, one way and back, but not at maximum speed, just at 75% of their max speed. And the white player has to go back and forward to the red cone at maximum intensity, but because it's really close, it's going to be adding accelerations and not high-speed running distances. So this is a way you can change this old way of seeing top-up sessions, compensatory training, and trying to make it more individualized to your players. Another way you can use GPS devices to make decisions through injury prevention. So this is a acute chronic workload. Basically, this compares what you've done this week to what you've been doing in the previous weeks. And that gives you a ratio. And we can see that if you're between 0.8 and 1.3, it's like a safe area. And anything outside that ratio, it increases the risk of injury. Probably if you're under 0.8 is because you're under training. So when you need to compete again, you're not going to be as ready as possible. And if you're above 1.3, you're overtraining. There's different ways to calculate this ratio. There's the coupled, uncoupled, and the exponentially weight moving averages. The most common ones are coupled and uncoupled because they're quite simple to calculate, whereas the exponential weight moving averages are really, it's quite hard to calculate, and they're only sensitive in the furthest parts of the curves and not as much in the middle. As you can see, the difference in the coupled and the uncoupled is that the chronic workload, it's a 4-week span, whereas in the uncoupled it's just 3 weeks. And we can see that in the coupled, it overlaps the chronic and acute load, and the uncoupled, they don't overlap. But this brings some mistakes or some doubts when you're monitoring load. If you can see, the top chart is the coupled workload, and the bottom chart is the uncoupled. And at the bottom, we can see some symbols. The red means that this player is at risk of getting injured. The yellow symbol means that we don't know because one ratio is telling you something and the other ratio is telling you something else. And green means that they're in a safe spot. So as you can see here, data at some points is useful because at the first 4 weeks, it's telling you that the athlete is at high risk of injury, whereas 2 of the weeks, we don't really know because one piece of data is telling us something and the other piece of data is telling us something else. That's because we are calculating them differently. Even though we're using the same numbers, the calculation is a bit different. So that makes these differences. My personal advice, choose one and stick with that one. Don't be looking at both of them at the whole time, all the time. And we can see nowadays some GPS brands already integrate this into their software. Not all of them, or not all of them intuitively. But we can see here that this is already starting to appear in all of the softwares. We can see the 2 lines. If you're in the middle, it's a blue zone, so you are safe there. If you're above that top red line, it means you're at high risk. And if you're not there yet, it's in a gray area. Now, obviously, even though we may try and control everything, we get players injured and we need to return them to play. So again, a player has been injured and you need to take steps little by little and trying to reach that level of fitness they used to have. We can see here 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, 4.1, 4.2. That's how the player advanced through their recovery. The blue line is always 100%, which is what they normally did when they competed in the matches. And the red is what they've done in that training session in terms of fitness-wise. And we can see as the player advances in that recovery that he is getting closer to his competitive profile, what we spoke at the beginning. It always comes back to a competitive profile because you're training towards that competition. So in this case, we are seeing how the player improves and how he's getting closer to that competitive profile throughout his recovery. There's many ways to show this. There's also this way to show it as little. And for example, in this case, sprint distance wasn't introduced until the 6th week, and everything really progressively. It just depends how you give this information, but the nicer it looks. In this case, it's color coded, depending on the phase of the recovery. It's a good piece of artistic artistic effect you can give to the doctor or whoever needs this information. And this is a table that gives you the what you need to focus on in terms of data depending on an injury. So nowadays we know that for hamstring injuries you need to focus on high speed running distance to make it progressively and accelerations. But for example, in the adductor, it's different. It's more focusing only on the accelerations rather than the high speed running. So depending on the injury, you need to look at different numbers, different variables, see what they're saying, and not only what happens in the field. You also need to look at what happens in the gym, strength tests, etc. Now it's when we're going to start looking at decision making within monitoring load properly. So there's this cycle called the athlete monitoring cycle, which is something that theoretically, practically is quite hard, but theoretically you should be doing always, which is seeing what the player, point one, external load, seeing what the player did in the training session or the match, then go towards analyzing it and comparing it with their internal load. So how did the player respond to that exercise they've just done? Then you can see their perceptual well-being. So basically, how well do they feel the day after? How recovered do they feel? And then we go back into the readiness, which is a test that doesn't provoke any fatigue, but a test that will see how ready he is for competition. So for today's purpose, because we are looking into external load through GPS, we're only going to focus on the ones that are connected to it. So we won't have too much time talking about perceptual well-being. And some ways you can track all of this is through this external load through GPS devices, internal load through RPE, heart rate, lactate, perceptual well-being, questionnaires, how well did you sleep, how well do you feel recovered, etc. And readiness, it could be a counter movement jump before training or before the match. Normally, on a day-to-day basis, you focus on external, internal, perceptual well-being. And then when it's closer to a match, you look into the readiness towards that competition. There you go. So now, how do you, let's focus on point number one, external load. So this is a really good paper. I do recommend you to read it if you have some time. And how do you plan the week and how does this actually happen? So obviously, I'm going to go forward a few slides here. Every column, starting from the second one, is a different day. And that's what you plan for that week. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's going to happen in the training session. It's a team sport and it's very chaotic. You're never going to get the numbers perfect. So here, when it comes and introduces this equation, which looks very long, but it's actually quite simple. It's basically what did you have planned and what did you do? And that difference, you need to compensate it the day after and so on until you get to the game. In this case, they talk about working forward. So from the game to the game -1. I normally work the other way around, but at the end of the day, it's the same. And this is some way you can present the data, which is basically what you've done every week to see the chronic training loads and the safe parameters. And again, this is what you have planned for every training session. And this column is what you can see at the right. And this is quite simple because you can bring this in a piece of paper or in the iPad to the training session. And at the end of the session, you can compare it and you can see if any of the players needs to do a bit more or has done a bit too much. And you can get a bit of feedback there in the field without needing to download the data and making decisions a bit too late. So again, this allows you to adapt your training session through live. Going forward into the internal workload, so at the end of the training session, players will send us the RPE, rate of perceived exertion, and then we compare it. We compare this to what they've normally done in the field. So we can create this kind of chart, which in the x-axis, we have the external load, as you can see in the right, external load. And in the y-axis, you can have internal load. And this has to be specific to the day code, so the day you're training. You cannot compare the day before the match with 4 days before the match because you're training completely different things and it's going to give random numbers. So you need to make sure that you're comparing the same days throughout these comparisons. So in this case, if we look at match day -4, and we're normally looking into accelerations, we can put into the external load axis high intensity accelerations, and in the top we can put rate of perceived exertion. And at the end of the session, you might get something like this, which basically tells you where every star is a different player, and it tells you where they land within that training session compared to previous training sessions. But to understand this, you first need to understand how we are actually measuring it, because it's from -3 to +3, and from -3 again to +3. And that's all to do with something we call set score. And it basically tells you how far away you are from the mean. So if you get in terms of the standard deviation. So if you get a value of 0, you are in the mean. That's the mean. 0 is the mean. And if you get a value of 1, it means you are the mean plus a standard deviation. And anything within -1 and 1, we consider normal. And anything away from that, so under -1 or above +1, we consider extreme. And that's how we create these boxes. As we can see in the bottom right, if they're doing more external loads, so they are doing more high intensity accelerations, and the internal perception of the training was that it wasn't very hard, it means they are adapting to the training we're doing. In contrast, if they've done more than they normally do, but they respond that it was very hard, the training session, very intense, they will land in the top right, and that will probably mean that we gave them a bit too much of overload. If we go to the bottom left, it probably means that we didn't give them enough training stimulus, and that's why they didn't respond as much. And if we are in the top left, where we have that maladaptation, it's where players are getting unfit, so they're doing less than what they're normally doing, and they're responding with more stress than normally. So what we would do, it would be only analyze the ones that are a bit anomalous. The ones that are training adequately, or they are somewhere normal, we won't look at them. You just look at the ones that are a bit rare. So in this case, it's all made up, okay? But on the bottom left, we can see this player did less than normally, but that's because he was coming from an injury and he was doing partial training. So he just did 2 of the drills. So that could explain that. So maybe we don't need to make any decisions there. Basically, it's what happened. Top left, he's maladapted, but we can see that he's quite close to the middle area, and that's in this case because he's just returned from injury. He's already competing with the team, but he needs to catch up a bit in fitness wise. In the middle and above, we can see he overreacted to the training session, and in this case we can see in the questionnaires the day after that he did not sleep well, so maybe that was what triggered that response. Still, we would have a good look into that player and make sure that there's not something else bothering it. If we can see top right, sometimes we need to adapt the training session in situ in the moment because a player gets injured or a player is ill and he can't come and we need to change the whole training session. In this case, maybe this player had to repeat a few tasks because numbers didn't match, and maybe he did a bit too much than he was supposed to. And in the bottom right, we might have a player that is playing more than normal. Lately, he's playing a lot, so he's developing more fitness-wise than normally. And here, decisions you might take. Top right, he did a bit too much, so maybe the day after, you need to make sure he lands into a recovery phase rather than too much stress. The one that he didn't sleep well in the middle, you might want to have a look into maybe giving him some rest because he's probably taking longer to recover than normally. So it's not a right or wrong answer, but it kind of indicates you where to go. Now, if we look into readiness, this is a paper that was published, I think it was 1 month ago or 2 months ago, which basically compared every week of the season how ready the player was, if they were well prepared, not well prepared, or normally prepared. And then they compare it to what they did in the week and how ready they felt the week after. And they did that for all the year with all the players and found some patterns. Here we can see in red, the column in red, which basically says that when the team is not ready physically, it benefits from reducing the distance and reducing the mechanical load. And doing that, it appears that the following week he'll be more ready, and that following the rest of the weeks. In the other part of the spectrum, if we look at good readiness, if the team is good in terms of fitness-wise and it feels good, what we can see in this paper is to try and not fluctuate the distance too much. The distance they're doing in a training session, it has to be similar to the previous week. So in this way, we can see how the team is feeling in terms of readiness, and we can try and adapt the training sessions for the following week to make sure we are improving the readiness or sustaining that good readiness throughout as long as we can. Obviously, it's team sport, it's soccer, a lot of matches. There's moments of the season you are doing very well, moments you're not doing as well, but your job as a conditioning coach and as the manager and second coach is to try and be as close to your peak performance as long as possible. So this is a strategy we can have to make decisions every so often on how to change that training session to make sure our athletes are more ready the following week. So now this brings some final thoughts because I saw this very big chart. I don't know if you can see it well. And this is basically everything that impacts a player performance within the context. If you can see in green, the things that are highlighted in green is things you can modify. Orange is things that you can somehow modify or alter a bit. And red, it's things you cannot control. And then we can see in yellow and with a circle in red, I made sure you could see that. That's training load management. So it's a really big picture, and obviously it's a green area. It's an area we can manipulate throughout the week. It's an area we can have a really big impact. But the picture is really, really big. Um, and sometimes I feel because we can get a lot of objective data from training load, we believe it's sometimes a bit more important than it is, or we forget the whole picture, and we probably shouldn't be forgetting the whole picture. Sometimes it's more important to get the basic things right than the complex ones. We came back from a tournament in where was it, in the north, I don't remember where, in the north of Spain, and we arrived really late, and we were supposed to be training the day after. But logic was they're not going to sleep much. They have school the day after. At least let them go to school and then go back to their homes after and recover, rather than just coming back again to train. Again, it's all about common sense. Sometimes it's not right or wrong answer. It's about looking at the bigger picture, seeing which ones you can influence, because there's a lot of things you can influence, and try and manipulate those rather than manipulating the ones, just one of them, or focusing on one of them. You need to look at the bigger picture. Ath- uh, Athlete monitoring is a vital tool. Why? Because if we go back to this slide, we can see it's in red, in green. It's something we can manipulate, and we can manipulate quite easily. And as we've seen in previous slides, there is wait a second. There we go. There's a lot of things you can impact through monitoring load, through understanding what's happening, training, preventing injuries, coming back from play. So it's obviously a vital tool, but the fact that it's a vital tool doesn't mean it's the only tool we must be looking into. As we've seen throughout the whole presentation, no single metric can clearly state the risk of injury. It can give you an idea. Acute chronic workload will give you an idea of the risk. High speed will give you an idea of hamstring injury, but you also need to have a look into eccentric strength in the hamstrings. You can also have a look into their previous history. It's not about a single metric that will give you the right answer. So we cannot allow objective data to drive our definite decisions. There is way more than just objective data to make these decisions. Athlete monitoring today stands between art and science. Going back to this slide, I can't go back. There we go. Going back to this slide, we can see that it's a big puzzle, and we need to try and fit everything together. And it's not as simple as 1+1. It is way more complex than that. So it's also an art, and it's something I got told in England when I was there. And it was basically that a strength and conditioning coach is also an artist, because you need to try and fit everything in really small spaces. And so keep that in mind, that sometimes you will be breaking the rules, but sometimes you need to break them. And final point here, training load management, it's very complex, but it's an important piece of the puzzle, and it can help you guide to make decisions, but you need to be aware that there's a very big picture. And with all of that in mind, you can maximize the performance and the team success, and make sure you don't punish yourself too much when you make an error. Again, it's not the right or wrong answers, so there'll be times you'll have errors throughout your career, your experiences. You need to learn from them and see how you could have prevented them. But again, it's not right or wrong. You'll get it wrong at some point, and uh, from there you can learn. Before saying goodbye, I would like to recommend these four papers to read. The first one, I don't think it's published yet, but you can access it. And it's a really interesting one about how the most demanding scenario changes depending on the contextual factors. It's not the same if you're winning, if you're losing, if you're playing at home, if you're playing away, the size of the pitch. Sometimes we don't reach the maximum demand scenarios when we play away because the pitches are very small. And obviously, this paper allows you to understand a bit more what happens in different scenarios and how can that alter your data. Second one, monitoring athlete training loads consensus statement. This one is important if you want to understand more about training loads. It's not specific on football, it'll give you a really good idea on how to manage load and other ways. There are many other ways to manage load. The third one, impact of much, again, going back to contextual variables and seeing how that affects other other parameters. And this one's a whole season study, so it's also a good one. And the last one, training monitoring in football. It's quite interesting because it's not as scientific. It is very scientific, but it's not as scientific as the other ones. So it's more of a story being told rather than a paper where you read the intro, the methods, the results, and the conclusions. So this one's quite nice if you don't really like scientific papers. Have a good look at it and understand what's happening before diving into the other ones. And I think I spoke a bit too fast for this one. I think there's a few questions there waiting for us. So,
Yeah, Jorge, thank you so much for this great speech. So I have a question here from one of our listeners. How do you get those data, and how do you make the graphs? And through if you use some concrete software to do it.
okay, so the GPS data, so the one with the graphs, we get the data. Let's go back to. There we go. Almost there. There we go. This data, we get it. So we get it from the GPS devices. These GPS devices are downloaded into a computer, and that is then uploaded into a cloud. And we can then see that data. We normally download it, and we put it in this case it's an Excel. But there's many other softwares you can use to visualize the data. You can also use Power BI, which is something we're transitioning to right now. You can also use R Studio, which is something that's emerging a lot now in sports scientists, and I think it's something you get taught in the masters. So yeah, visualizing data normally comes from one of those softwares. The own GPS software also allows you to see it, but normally if you want something very concrete, you need to go through other softwares to see it.
Nice. I have one more question regarding artificial intelligence. Do you think, or are you thinking about using it for data analysis? For example, now I know that you have a lot of data from all the different seasons, at least 4 or 5 seasons already, more or less using GPS in Real Madrid with your own players. So maybe you can start using it for a predictive pattern to maybe prevent injury, for example, or to actually predict performance or when to sub or something like that?
Yes. So this is something that also the company StatSports is looking into, and not only that one. Other ones are having a look into it, about predicting injuries before they actually happen. And again, I think artificial intelligence is something that is here and is here to stay because it's a really powerful tool. But as long as we don't make the same errors that we've been doing in the past of just looking at the data and forgetting about what's really happening, I think it has a space in our training. But I think you always need to use common sense first. But yeah, definitely artificial intelligence is something that sooner or later we'll be looking into, for sure.
Great. Thank you so much for your answer. I have one more question from our listeners. Do you have data analysts working with you, or is not necessary for this?
So depending on the category, so in the academy we don't have a data analyst as such. The first team does have a data analyst, and within the academy we have people who are a bit more focused on data analysis. Maybe their role is not just data analysis, but we cannot divide our work like that. It is something we want to implement at some point, and I know other teams have it, but it's something we're working towards.
All right, great. I have one question also. How many categories do you use GPS with? I mean, do you also use it with Benjamin and Alevin or not?
No. So first team uses GPSs only in training sessions because in the matches, GPSs don't work in the stadiums. So they need to use optical based tracking systems, that those are placed by La Liga. Then Castilla and the other teams use GPS until Juvenil C, which is under 17s. And those teams have GPS in all of the training sessions. And then under 16s and under 15s, we normally have GPS in all the training sessions because we borrow them from the under 23s or under 19s. But sometimes when we train at the same time, we might not have them for that training session. But that's where it ends, at under 15s.
Mhm. All right, I have one more question from our viewers. How we effectively decide with GPS data, sorry, for the athlete fatigue or overload train or not train? All right, I'm going to rephrase this a little bit. So, how do we effectively decide using GPS data if the athlete is fatigued or overloaded to train or not to train?
Okay, so obviously you look at the data, you see the acute chronic workload, and if it's in normal ranges, there's nothing that might alert you. But then if it's a bit outside, it's not about just being outside means that he is overtraining. You may need to go and talk to the player and see how he's feeling, ask him, see his questionnaires, and he may say, "No, I'm just a bit stressed lately," or maybe sometimes we get errors in data because he didn't turn his GPS on last week, so this week it appears that he did less in the previous week. So obviously you also need to have these things in mind, or when our players go to the national selection team and they don't have GPS devices or they don't use the same GPS as us, when they come back, they in terms of numbers they've done zero for a whole week, and that obviously affects that acute chronic workload. So then you need to be cautious with that and understand that that's not the right number. And I think there it's quite important the communication with the player, and also something I found quite interesting this year is making sure the players understand that they can come and talk to you and tell you I'm tired or I'm a bit tense. So I feel that communication is what's going to give you the final decision whether the player is overtraining or not. And again, it's not about looking at the team. At least you should be looking into different positions, because if you go into the same training sessions, the players are going to do something completely different. Tactics, if you're training tactics, the wing backs will run more than the center backs, etc. So comparing all of them to the whole team is not fair. You at least need to look at the positions, and in the best case scenario, you should be looking into the individuals.
All right, great. So one more question. How do, for example, for a player that is maybe a more atypical profile for a goalkeeper, how well does the GPS help you provide the actual load?
Yeah, so in the past, it wasn't very useful, because most of the match by the goalkeeper is walking most of the match, and he only sprints 2 or 3 times in the whole match, or he only accelerates or dives 10 times. So at the beginning, just by that, it was quite useless. But these GPSs have a gyroscope. Look, I actually have one here. They have a gyroscope inside, which detect whether the GPS is looking this way, or it's looking that way, or it's looking diagonally, or if it's moving forward or backwards. So when the goalkeeper dives and hits the ground, this is detected, and how hard it hits the ground, and then how fast it gets back up. It kind of tracks that fluent movement, and it can tell you how hard the goalkeeper has fallen into one side or the other side. And maybe it could help you adapt the training session in terms of this match, the player dived the goalkeeper dived a lot. So today, instead of focusing on diving, we'll work on footwork. Or in a match, maybe the opposite team was crossing a lot of balls, and then the GPS detected a lot of jumps, and that could then indicate in the GPS profile that the goalkeeper performed a lot of jumps. So maybe you could avoid that the days after the match. So yeah, nowadays this this GPS device gives you also information about the movements, and more specific to the position. It's also happening in basketball. It's also happening in hockey. They are adding these specific metrics, which are specific for the sport or the position, which allow you to track the load specific in their movements, which in the past it was quite useless.
All right. Thank you so much for for everything, Jorge, for the speech, for answering our questions and everything. So everyone, I hope you have enjoyed this. You have enjoyed this time, this hour with us, and hope to see you soon in another one like this one, or even in the masters. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.